My name is Eli Mercer, and if you'd told me 5 years ago that I'd be standing in front of a rusted gate with a notice stapled to it saying my family ranch had been sold while I was on duty, I'd have laughed and gone back to whatever ordinary thing I was doing that day. But that's how it started, with an envelope and a look on my buddy Jonah's face I'll never forget, equal parts pity and that kind of quiet anger that makes your chest tighten. 3 sentences. That's all it took to drop the world out from under me, because the notice said, plain as day, auction scheduled, property to be sold due to lien. My grandfather's land, the place where I learned to fix a tractor and how to shut up and listen when the wind told you something. Gone, maybe, before I even had time to go home. I'm not some big shot lawyer, and I'm not rich. I farmed that place with my hands, not my head. I knew the land like an old friend. My dad taught me how to read a fence line the way some men read a map. My grandfather, old Tom, built the barn with his own hands and left us a deed that smelled like cedar and cigarette smoke. So when Jonah slapped that envelope down and said, Eli, there's paperwork, looks official, I felt sick in a way that has nothing to do with physical pain. It's a hollowing. You walk around and your history feels like someone else's costume. You have to picture the place to get why it hurt. Red Oak Hollow sits on a low ridge where the river slows, and the grass folds like an old quilt. The house is modest, 2 stories, a sagging porch, and the barn sits off to the left with our initials carved on a post. People talk about legacy like it's a catchphrase, oh, family legacy, but to me it was the sound of cattle at dawn, the smell of coffee over a cold morning, the photograph of my grandmother on the mantel with a cigarette in the corner of her mouth. Losing it wasn't losing an asset. It was losing a life. So I flew back the next chance I had. The Navy had put me on leave when I told them, and Jonah met me at the gate, hat in his hand, because that's what Jonah Dosh's, part mechanic, part pastor, all stubborn loyalty. We stood there and pulled the nails out together, folding the paper carefully, like it might still breathe. The notice was signed by a name I'd never heard, Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. Willow Ridge. The name sounded polite enough, like a cul-de-sac with potted geraniums. That's the thing about names, they can lie. Willow Ridge turned out to be a small cluster of houses on the back end of my family's meadow. They'd built their pretty little cul-de-sac directly across a portion of my grandfather's surveyed line, and apparently they'd been running a show behind closed doors. At first, I thought it was a clerical error. You always want to give people the benefit of the doubt, at least I do. But then Jonah handed me a photo from last month. A beige split level with a sign that said, Private Community No Trespassing, and a new mailbox planted where an old stone marker used to be. The stone marker me grandfather had hammered his initials into it the day the property had been split, back when paper needed ink and everyone trusted their neighbors. The marker was gone. The sympathy disappeared. Now there was a tightness in my throat that had a dangerous edge. We started asking questions. Jonah is the kind of guy who knows how to get people to talk. He's part mechanic, as I said, and part small-town hazard. We knocked on a few doors and got smiles so rehearsed they were almost performance art, and one woman passed us a note that read like it had been written by someone who hoped they never had to explain themselves in court. We learned the HOA had a board, a president named Marjorie Hale, and a stack of fees that grew like ivy, creeping over property lines and rights of way until whole parcels were swallowed. Someone had filed a lien while I was away. Someone had pushed an auction through under a deadline no one had been told about. And someone had, quite possibly, manipulated a Plato's maps they make that tell what's his so that the records look tidy on paper and messy in life. This is where Act 2 starts, where I stop reacting and start moving. The thing about a problem like this is you can't fight it with feelings alone. You need facts, and you need allies. I called an attorney I knew through Jonah Carmen Stone, who used to handle municipal cases and had a reputation for reading a file like a Bible. Carmen listened, then said one sentence that made me feel like she had just handed me a plan. We don't start by shouting at them. We start by proving them wrong. We dug into county records. We found the deed where my grandfather had filed the property almost 50 years ago, told the clerk about boundary markers, old measurements, distances that don't translate into someone's new fence. Carmen brought up the Service Members Civil Relief Act, which protects people on active duty from certain legal actions. I'd been deployed, and that law can delay or undo processes that trample on a service member's rights. That was a key one legal wedge we could use. But law is slow and paper-heavy. We needed boots on the ground. I called Miguel, a surveyor and friend I'd known since high school. He showed up with a tape measure and a calm face, and together we walked those lines, GPS in hand, the way you search for the truth by measuring inches. What we found was telling. Survey markers moved, property pins replaced, and in one place, someone had poured a concrete post right where an original boundary had been marked. The new fence didn't match the old plat. When Carmen started pulling recorded minutes from HOA meetings, we found signatures, not of homeowners, but of people who claimed to be acting on behalf of others' power of attorney used like a quick-fix stamp. There were invoices for community improvements that went to companies none of the homeowners had ever heard of. There were transfers from HOA accounts to private accounts with names that matched no one in town. The more we dug, the more the whole thing smelled like a set-up-hand inside job dressed in committee minutes and notarized signatures. That's the moment your life accents. The sense that this thing is not just a mistake. It's a design. People like Marjorie, I learned, don't build power by accident. They stack the deck, they collect favors, they make quiet calls. She had a way of smiling like a judge and talking like she'd never been wrong. In public, she was Willow Ridge's guardian angel except her halo had a ledger book attached. We started with small strikes. Carmen sent certified letters, formal legal notices that said, in gentle governmentese, please explain. The HOA responded with a stack of paperwork so glossy it looked like a brochure sales pamphlets, a stamped authorization, and a treasurer's report that painted everything as above board. But their records didn't match the county's. That discrepancy gave us leverage. We filed a motion to put a hold on any property sales and construction while the matter was reviewed. That buy time is everything. When people think the bulldozer will come tomorrow, they panic and make mistakes. We let the clock do the heavy lifting. Then something happened that feels almost too cinematically perfect, an internal revolt. Not everyone at Willow Ridge was on board. Boards are made of neighbors, and neighbors have relatives and reputations. A treasurer, old Mr. Green, started to sputter in private. He confessed that some transfers had been misclassified, and that there was a bank account Mrs. Hale insisted remain private. Suddenly we had a leak, and leaks turn into rivers fast. Jonah, with his way of being plain-spoken, sat down over coffee with Mr. Green, and the old man broke like a dry branch, gave us copies of ledgers and receipts that had been tucked away, as if someone expected them to never be opened. Those papers showed payments that didn't make sense for a homeowner board, consulting fees to a shell company, reimbursements to a P.O. box, and a contractor who operated out of a neighboring county but billed like they lived in Willow Ridge. When county attorneys get a whiff of a messy paper trail, they start asking about re-recorded plats and whether anyone had filed an amended survey without proper notice. Deputy County Attorney Rachel Ortega-Sharp, patient and with a voice that suggested she'd seen this kind of thing before, called Carmen and asked for our files. The county opened an inquiry. That's when this quiet tug-of-war shifted into the public arena. Stop work orders went up on one house after another. Construction crews stopped showing up. People started to talk in ways they hadn't before, on porches, at diners, the kind of conversation that used to be private because people were ashamed, and now the shame had a target. We prepared for the hearing like you prepare for a fight you know you can win if you don't flinch. Carmen coached me. Stick to facts. Don't get theatrical. Let the evidence do the talking. I practiced what I would say until my tongue could walk the words blindfolded. The funny thing was I wanted to be loud, I wanted to yell, but I knew yelling only makes people think you're compensating. We made a stack of exhibits. The original deed, photographs comparing old and new boundary markers, bank statements from the HOA, and the treasurer's ledger with the entries Mr. Green had provided. Those documents aren't glamorous, but they are honest. They're the kind of thing that ages people's lives. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse smelled like recycled air and coffee. Seats filled fast. People showed up for reasons that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with waking up to find their neighborhood had a secret in it. Marjorie arrived like she owned the carpet silk scarf, tailored jacket, the kind of posture that says I've practiced being unimpeachable in the mirror. She carried a stack of papers that looked like it had been printed with confidence, and she smiled at people as if smiles can erase facts. There's a certain type of person who can smile while the floor is on fire. She had that skill. I sat in the audience with Jonah and Carmen. We felt small, but we felt steady. The hearing opened with formalities pleasantries that sound like the opening credits of a show but quickly turned to witness testimony. Carmen asked questions like she was laying tracks for a train. Each question needed to land precisely so the locomotive of truth could run straight. Miguel testified about the markers, and his professionalism carried the day, spoke like a man who dealt in inches and couldn't be swayed by a pretty face in the audience. Mr. Green, hands trembling, read aloud the ledger entries. You could hear a pin drop. The county attorney walked the commissioners through the legal requirements for re-recording a plat. Notices must be sent, signatures must be verified, and changes have to be transparent. When the commission compared the county's records to what Willow Ridge had filed, the mismatch read like an admission. Then we hit the scene that became the moment people replayed in their heads for weeks. Carmen cross-examined Marjorie. I don't mean cross-examined like a TV drama where someone bawls. Carmen was all calm precision. She held up an invoice and asked, "Who paid this consulting firm?" And Marjorie, trained to smile and deflect, said, "Our board approved it." Carmen asked, "Was that board majority voted at a meeting that was open to all homeowners?" Marjorie's smile flickered. She answered, "I believe so." Carmen's follow-up was clinical. "Do you have minutes of that meeting?" The room seemed to inhale. That's when Mr. Green spoke up, quietly, then louder, saying, "Not here weren't minutes. I handled the book, and I didn't record that." The sound of Marjorie's composure cracking was a small, human thing like ice splitting underfoot, and once the crack appears, it spreads. Marjorie tried to spin explanations. Power of attorney used for absentee owners, emergency votes taken during a storm season, uncomfortable phrases that sounded like someone inventing reasons as they go. But the commissioners weren't buying the theater. The decisive blow came when an old neighbor, a man named Ray who'd lived in the area for 40 years, produced a photograph of the original stone marker, the one with my grandfather's initials, and compared it with a new picture where the marker was replaced with a decorative mail post. Images don't argue, they show. The commission voted to invalidate the amended plat pending resurvey and ordered any liens and pending auctions stayed. They also referred the matter to the county prosecutor for investigation into possible fraud and misappropriation of funds. I remember feeling like air re-entering a lung. But even with that win, this story didn't end on a single courtroom high. People are complicated. Some of the homeowners had benefited at least temporarily from the new arrangements. Houses that looked like tidy investments were now wrapped in legal uncertainty. There were neighbors who argued that despite the irregularities, the new development had improved property values. There were complicated conversations about who knew what and when, and the lines between victim and beneficiary blurred. I realized then that justice isn't always a clean cut. Sometimes it's a messy, communal negotiation where everyone has to sit at the table. Marjorie's house ended up empty for a while, a kind of shrine to the way people hide behind committees. The county seized records, and auditors started tracing payments. There were whispered deals, angry phone calls, and a few loud apologies, some sincere, others clearly crafted by publicists. The treasurer, Mr. Green, resigned and agreed to cooperate. The county prosecutor filed charges. I won't pretend watching that paperwork move felt like closure. It felt necessary, and it felt slow. The law moves in its own rhythm, and you have to learn to breathe with it. Walking the property after the decision, the land felt both familiar and foreign. We had to restake boundary lines. We had to correct the plat, literally drawing back what had been taken. The physical work, putting the post back, replacing the stones, re-erecting the gate felt like a ritual. Jonah and I drove posts into earth that had known our family's footfalls for generations. People who had once crossed their arms on porches started showing up to help. Wounds are easier to heal when hands get busy. The community had been wounded, and the healing was not instant. There was talk of restitution, of reimbursing homeowners who had been misled, and of putting protections in place so no one could quietly change a community's course again. The conversation was messy and human, and rightfully so. There were personal costs. My family's name had been dragged through procedural mud, and friends who'd once waved at me with a casual warmth now looked at me with a complicated gaze, like seeing an old photo where the colors have shifted. I had nights where I stared at the ceiling and thought about walking away from it all, how easier it would be to sell up and find a quieter life elsewhere. But then I'd remember the smell of my grandfather's coffee, the way the river bends below the meadow, the laughter of my niece the summer she learned to fish and I knew I couldn't. Some things aren't about money or comfort. They're about what you're willing to stand for. At one point, Marjorie came to the property. She asked to walk the line with me, and part of me wanted to slam the gate and tell her to leave. Instead, we walked. She was a smaller person without the platform of power, and there was a moment maybe too human for some narratives where she said, "I thought I was doing what was best." The county's judgment returned several parcels to the original configuration, and there was an agreement, a hard, awkward compromise about what would happen to those houses. Some would be offered back to original heirs if they chose. Others would be handled in auctions under strict oversight to prevent the quick flips that had caused the mess. We also pushed for transparency rules, clear notice to absentee owners, mandatory minutes for HOA meetings, and third-party audits when large sums move through community accounts. Those are small wins, but they add up. Here's the thing about endings: theory rarely tidy. We had a courtroom victory and a practical restoration, but the community still argued over the aftertaste. There were editorial pieces claiming vigilante self-righteousness. There were Facebook threads where old friends traded barbs in public. Some people said I had done something heroic. Others called it grandstanding. Both things can be true. My neighbor, Mrs. Kleinold, with arthritis and a voice the color of a well-worn sweater, told me, "You didn't save the ranch for yourself, Eli. You saved it for the place the kids will remember." That's what kept me steady on bad nights. The thought that what we do echoes through other people's memories. It's worth saying this out loud. There was anger, yes, and satisfaction when the truth came out. There was also regret for the ways people had gotten pulled into the wrong currents: neighbors who signed without reading, spouses who trusted convenience, people who let an opportunity dull their moral compass. None of this is simple. Power looks like competence until it starts looking like theft. Community looks like solidarity until someone decides money matters more than trust. The complicated human motives: greed, fear, envy, hope are what make a story more than a headline. I didn't want to end this with a moral lecture. I'm not that person. But if you're listening, if you live in a place with an HOA or a neighborhood association or any group that makes rules that can change your life, be curious. Ask questions. Don't be embarrassed to ask who received what and why. When the world asks you to trust paper, remember paper can be forged or misfiled. If something feels off, there's probably a reason. Hold on to your history and respect other people's histories, too. A few months after the hearing, we held a community meeting in the old barn. People brought chairs and casserole dishes, practical things for practical people. We talked about rules, about restitution, and about how to make sure no one could weaponize neighborhood governance again. We added a clause to require public ballots for any major land decisions, and we worked with the county to create a more transparent notice system for absentee landowners. It's not perfect, laws rarely are, but it was progress that felt like progress. On the day I retacked the gate sign, standing there with Jonah and Carmen and a handful of neighbors who'd weathered the storm, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and peace. The sign read, "Red Oak Hollow Mercer Family Land," a small, personal marker more sentimental than legal. The county's corrected plat was what mattered in the registries, but the sign was for the people who drive down that road and remember where they came from. I walked the fence line and pressed my palm against the old post where my grandfather's initials had been. The wood was worn but stubborn. That stubbornness felt like the best kind of inheritance. So what do you do when you find yourself up against an organization that feels invincible? You measure, you document, you find allies, and you don't let fear make decisions for you. You also listen to the people around you. Jonah's steady presence, his refusal to be cynical, kept me grounded. Carmen's faith in the system, her insistence on process, gave me tools. Miguel's quiet competence reminded me facts matter. And the small kindness neighbor who brought a casserole, the old man who dug up ledger pages, those are the things that turn a legal battle into something that heals, or at least begins to. Power concentrates quietly, and sometimes it wears a ribbon that says community. And sometimes the people who need to stand up are built not from dramatic gestures, but from the daily work of showing up, going to meetings, reading records, asking the uncomfortable questions. If you're ever confronted with a notice stapled to your gate, don't assume it's a mistake or that you can't fight. You may be more anchored than you think. Before I go, There's one image I can't shake: the day the county's order went public and people started to walk across the meadow with tools and laughter, repairing things that had been broken. Kids ran past with kites, and old men compared scars. There was a neighbor who used to keep to himself who came and started painting the barn with me, a slow, steady stroke that felt like reclaiming more than a structure. That day felt, in small ways, like restoration. So tell me, what would you have done if it had been you? Would you have fought the same way, or would you have walked away? Do HOAs have a place when they're run honestly, or are they an invitation for the wrong kinds of people to take advantage? Drop your thoughts below. Tell me whether you think property and legacy are worth defending at all costs, or if some things are better left behind. Share your own stories about standing up to small power structures, what worked, what didn't. If you like this, give it a share, and if you want to see more stories like this, people fighting the slow, quiet thefts of everyday life, hit follow. I'll be around to read what you write.